Imagine waking up tomorrow, right? You decide to sell the house you currently live in. You take all that equity you've built up over the years, and you just go across town to buy the exact same house.
Right. Same exact footprint.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You aren't, upgrading to a bigger yard. You aren't moving to a wealthier zip code or a better school district. You are literally just swapping your current three-bedroom house for an identical three-bedroom house.
A completely sideways move.
Right. A completely sideways move. But then you sit down to sign the paperwork, and the bank informs you that your monthly payment is going to instantly double.
Oh, my God.
You owe an extra like $1,700 every single month just for the privilege of moving sideways.
That sounds like a total clerical error, honestly.
Yeah.
Or, I don't know, a terrible financial nightmare.
It really does.
But what you're describing right there is the absolute baseline reality of the American housing market right now.
Which is just wild to even say out loud.
It is. The mathematical machinery that dictates how we buy and sell and live in our homes, it is fundamentally broken down.
And I am so, so glad you are here to help decode this today. Because for everyone listening, this isn't just, a spreadsheet problem.
No.
Usually when we talk about reaching a major life milestone in this country, we use this metaphor of a ladder.
Right, the corporate ladder, the property ladder.
Exactly. You get a job, you grab the first rung, you save some money, you reach the next one. And for generations, the most solid, visible rung on that American ladder was housing.
You can always see it right there above you.
Yeah. You knew where it was. But lately, if you're trying to buy a house today, it feels like millions of people are reaching up. And not only are the rungs suddenly way further apart, but the entire ladder has basically been encased in a giant block of ice.
That is a really visceral image.
Yeah.
And mechanically, it's actually incredibly accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah. The ladder hasn't disappeared,
Right.
but it has completely changed its physical properties. It is frozen solid.
Right.
And it's incredibly slippery for anyone trying to climb it today. We are looking at a market that is just paralyzed.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand what broke, we have to agree on what the machine looked like when it was actually working, right?
We need that baseline.
Yeah. Think about the older American bargain for a second. If you look at our parents' or our grandparents' generation, the expectation was pretty straightforward.
This is a very legible system.
Right. It made sense. You worked. You saved up what you could. You bought something modest.
The classic starter house.
Exactly. I'm talking about the starter house with the used couch in the living room where you spent your weekends painting the walls yourself because you couldn't afford to hire anyone.
And you fixed it up over time.
Yeah.
You replaced the roof 5 years later when you actually had the savings to do it.
Yeah, you didn't do it all on day one.
Right. You added a room when the kids came along. You planted a tree in the backyard. And, this is key, you actually expected to live there long enough to see it provide shade.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
It was a very gradual process of building stability.
Right. It wasn't about instant luxury or, treating the house like a day trading stock, checking its value on an app every morning.
No, absolutely not.
It was about building equity, even if people weren't really using financial jargon at the dinner table. They were just building a life.
Exactly.
And look, I want to be clear to anyone listening. It wasn't perfect. Houses have always carried risk. Boilers break in the dead of winter.
Property taxes always go up.
Always. And obviously, redlining and historical inequalities kept a lot of people from ever participating in that bargain in the first place.
That's a very important caveat, yes.
But for the middle class that did have access to it, the system sort of made sense. You put in the wages and the time, and you got out a stake in the future. So what actually happened to that bargain? Why does it feel like the rules were rewritten overnight?
Well, the core thesis we really need to understand for this deep dive is that the current crisis is not just a simple story of prices gradually going up.
Like regular inflation.
Right. Not like the way the price of a gallon of milk or a dozen eggs goes up over time. Housing operates on its own timeline and follows its own distinct, very rigid logic.
Okay.
This crisis, it actually formed in two very distinct sequential stages.
2 stages.
Yes. First, we had an era of incredibly cheap money.
Yeah.
That artificially elevated the base price of homes across the entire country.
The huge price spikes.
Exactly. And then second, a rapid, historic shock in interest rates came along and completely froze that inflated market in place.
So it pushed it up and then trapped it there.
That's the sequence.
I want to dig into that first stage because I feel like people have a really short memory about how strange the economy was before the interest rate spiked.
Oh, they definitely do.
We lived in an era of incredibly cheap money for a long, long time.
We did. And to understand the trap you are currently sitting in as a buyer or a renter, we really have to look at the Federal Reserve. Right. The Fed effectively sets the baseline cost of borrowing money in the United States. Following the great financial crisis back in 2008, the Fed pushed their benchmark interest rate down to near zero.
To save the economy.
Exactly. And they kept it there, or very close to it, for years. They were desperately trying to stimulate the economy.
Right.
We eventually saw a brief, mild period of normalization, but then March 2020 happened.
The pandemic.
The COVID-19 pandemic triggered this massive global panic, and the Fed slashed rates right back down to rock bottom, a target range of 0 to 0.25%.
Hold on. I'm struggling to understand the exact link here. The Federal Reserve sets the rate that banks use to lend to each other overnight, right?
That's correct.
So how does a 0% Fed rate actually translate into someone paying like $100,000 over asking price for a ranch house in the suburbs?
That is the million-dollar question. Let's
Yeah.
trace the mechanics of it. When the Fed funds rate drops to 0, the yields on safe government bonds drop as well.
Because the government isn't paying out as much interest.
Exactly. Now, mortgage rates, specifically the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, are very closely tied to the yields on those bonds, particularly the 10-year Treasury note.
Okay, I follow.
Because investors aren't making any money on those safe government bonds anymore, all that money flows into mortgage-backed securities. And that massive influx of money drives mortgage interest rates down to historic lows.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. We saw mortgage rates drop to 3%, and in some crazy cases, into the high 2%.
Okay, so the cost of borrowing a massive amount of money just becomes incredibly, unbelievably cheap.
Precisely. And when borrowing costs are that low, it dramatically expands a regular buyer's purchasing power.
How much power are we talking?
Well, let's look at an example. Let's say you can comfortably afford to allocate $1,500 a month to a mortgage payment.
Okay.
If the interest rate is 6%, that $1,500 monthly payment allows you to borrow a certain fixed amount from the bank.
Right, the math is capped.
But if the interest rate suddenly drops to 3%, that exact same $1,500 a month suddenly allows you to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars more.
Just because the interest portion is so small.
Exactly. The principal you can afford balloons.
So in a vacuum, that sounds amazing for the buyer. It sounds like you're basically getting free money to buy a way nicer house.
It does sound amazing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Until you realize that every single other buyer in the entire market has access to the exact same cheap debt.
Oh, right.
So what happens? You find a house you like. It's listed for $300,000. You offer $300,000.
Sensible.
But another family, armed with this supercharged borrowing power, they offer $320,000.
Because they can afford the monthly payment.
Right. And then you realize your monthly payment at 3% is so low that you can easily afford to offer $340,000.
Bidding war.
A nationwide bidding war. The feller, realizing buyers have access to huge, cheap loans, gladly accepts the escalation.
Obviously, yeah.
The cheap money translates directly and almost immediately into soaring asset prices. The money wasn't used to buy better houses. It was just used to bid up the prices of the existing houses.
That is wild. Let's put some hard data behind this because the numbers are just staggering.
They really are.
In 2020, the median price of an existing home in the United States was roughly $296,500.
Under 300 grand.
Under 300. By 2023, just 3 years later, it had jumped to $389,800.
An incredible jump.
And it didn't stop. By March of 2026, it reached $408,800.
Just look at that trajectory. The entire country moved on to a massively higher price plateau in a phenomenally short period of time.
We're talking over 100 grand in a few years.
And this wasn't organic growth.
Yeah.
It wasn't based on the physical value of the homes magically improving. It was purely an expansion of debt capacity.
Now, the immediate counter-argument you always hear from, the optimists is, well, incomes went up too during that time. Wages grew. We had inflation, so people are just making more money.
Right, you hear that a lot. And that is technically true, but you have to look at the proportions.
Okay, let's look at them.
The data shows median household income rose from about $68,000 in 2020 to roughly $83,700 in 2024.
Okay, so that's a jump.
It is. That is a 23% jump in income, which is objectively strong wage growth for a 4-year period.
Uh,
But over a similar span, the median home price skyrocketed by roughly 38%.
A 38% jump in housing versus 23% in wages.
Exactly. The housing cost completely outpaced the wage gains.
You know, it reminds me of playing musical chairs, but the game is being played on a treadmill, and someone just keeps turning up the speed.
That's a great analogy.
People talk about home prices in the media as if buyers are just walking into a real estate office with a briefcase full of cash and paying the sticker price.
Which almost no one does.
Right. Almost nobody actually buys the sticker price. They are buying the monthly obligation. They are buying the next 30 years of payment.
That is a crucial distinction that completely gets lost in the headlines. What is affordability, really?
Right. How do we even define it?
The Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, has a standard definition. They say housing is considered affordable if it costs no more than 30% of your gross household income.
30%.
It's a useful rule of thumb.
Mm-hmm.
But if we run the numbers on what things look like in 2021, before the crisis really crystallized, you'll see that the margin for error was virtually non-existent even then.
Walk me through the math on that. I want to see the exact numbers.
Let's take a median home in 2021, which is about $350,700.
Okay.
Let's assume the buyer manages to pull together a 20% down payment, which, by the way, is a huge hurdle in itself, meaning they're financing around $280,500.
Got it.
At the time, mortgage rates were around 3%. So their principal and interest payment is roughly $1,180 a month.
Which, honestly, to anyone trying to buy a house today sounds like an absolute fantasy. $1,180.
It's nothing now.
People are paying twice that for a one-bedroom apartment right now.
It does sound like a dream from where we are sitting today. But let's look closer at the full picture. A mortgage payment isn't just principal and interest.
Right. The hidden costs.
Once you add in property taxes and homeowners insurance, that monthly cost easily moves into the $1,500 to $1,700 range.
$1,700.
Now, remember that median income of roughly $68,000 at the time?
Yeah.
That works out to about $5,700 a month in gross income. 30% of that gross income is roughly $1,700.
Wow. Okay.
Do you see it?
Yeah, I see it. So even in 2021, with rock bottom, historically low 3% interest rates, the typical home was already pushing right up against the absolute boundary of affordability for the typical American household.
Exactly. The system was incredibly stretched. The starting line for the American dream had already been moved far, far down the field.
Because the base prices were higher, the down payments had to be bigger.
The closing costs were higher.
Everything was inflated.
But because the interest rates were so artificially low, the system was still technically moving. People could just barely make the math work if they stretched their budgets to the absolute limit.
And then the financial weather completely reversed.
It did.
Which brings us to the second stage of this crisis. We go from this delicate, stretched setup of cheap money directly into the fastest monetary tightening cycle in modern history.
This is where your frozen ladder metaphor becomes reality. The stretched market we just described suddenly collided with a massive interest rate shock.
The Fed pivot.
Right. The Federal Reserve realized inflation was running hot, not just in housing, but in groceries, energy, supply chains. And they had to cool the broader economy down.
They had to stop the bleeding.
To do that, they had to make borrowing money expensive again.
And the timeline on this was incredibly aggressive.
Historic.
The Fed implemented their first rate hike in March 2022. And it just kept climbing. It peaked in July 2023. We went from essentially 0% up to a target range of 5.25% to 5.5% in just over a year.
And the speed of that increase is what caused the trauma. The housing market wasn't gently nudged into a new reality. It was violently shoved.
Yeah, pushed off a cliff.
When you look at the sales volume, you see the immediate physiological response of the market shutting down.
People just stopped buying.
In 2021, during the peak of the cheap money era, there were 6.12 million existing homes sold. That is a massive transaction volume.
But then the rate hikes hit the system. Wait, actually, I have a question here. If the cost of borrowing goes up, that means fewer people can afford to buy. So demand drops, right?
Correct.
If demand drops, shouldn't the prices of the homes drop to meet the remaining buyers? Isn't that basic economics 101, supply and demand? Why didn't housing prices immediately crash when rates spiked?
That is the logical assumption.
Right.
It's what everyone expected. but it completely ignores a unique phenomenon in the American housing market known as the lock-in effect.
The lock-in effect. Okay.
To understand why prices didn't crash, we have to look at what happened to the supply side.
Right.
Let's look at the transaction volume data first. In 2022, sales dropped from 6.12 million down to 5.03 million.
A huge drop.
In 2023, they plummeted to 4.09 million. And by March 2026, the annualized pace had fallen down to 3.98 million.
Under 4 million.
That is the weakest resale environment this country has seen since the mid-1990s. The transaction volume simply collapsed.
People just completely stopped moving.
They stopped moving because of what we call the math of replacement costs.
Replacement cost.
This is the invisible cage keeping everyone trapped. If we connect this to the bigger picture, let's walk through a scenario step by step.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's say you bought a very standard, solid, middle-class house right before COVID for $500,000.
Okay, my pre-COVID house.
You put 20% down, so you have a $400,000 loan. You locked in a 3% interest rate.
Beautiful.
Your monthly payment for principal and interest is roughly $1,686.
Okay, I'm with you. I have my $500,000 house, my $1,600 payment, and I'm happy.
Now, fast forward to today. You get a new job in a different city, or maybe you have another child and you simply need a fourth bedroom.
Life happens.
Exactly. If we take that exact same pre-COVID $500,000 house and adjust it for the national appreciation we've seen driven by that era of cheap money, that exact same property is now worth roughly $689,000 in today's market.
Right. So I decide to sell my house. I took my newly found equity and I go buy an identical house across town for $689,000.
A sideways move.
Yep. I put 20% down again from the proceeds of my sale. My new loan is going to be $551,500.
Correct.
But the rates aren't 3% anymore. Let's say I get a fairly standard current rate of 6.3%. What happens to my monthly payment?
Your new principal and interest payment jumps to roughly $3,414 a month.
What? Wait, I need to make sure I am fully grasping this.
Mhm.
I am buying the exact same caliber of house. I didn't add a pool. I didn't move to a gated community. I just moved sideways to a house of identical value. And my monthly payment goes from $1,686 to over $3,400.
Yes. That is a massive financial penalty. That's over $1,700 extra every single month just for the privilege of swapping your old mortgage for a new one.
That is insane.
That is the replacement cost crisis. You aren't just buying a new physical structure. You are being forced to surrender an incredibly valuable financial asset, your cheap debt, and take on incredibly expensive debt.
I call this the golden handcuffs of real estate. People aren't in love with their floor plans or their neighborhoods. They are in love with their mortgage rates.
And the data proves it absolutely. If you wonder why inventory didn't rise when demand fell, look at the composition of outstanding mortgages.
What does it look like?
According to data looking at the end of 2025, an astonishing 19.7% of all outstanding mortgages in the United States were still locked in at rates below 3%.
Below 3.
And over half, 50.6% of all mortgages, were below 4%.
Over half the country is sitting on a mortgage rate that starts with a 3 or lower. Why on earth would anyone ever voluntarily sell?
They wouldn't. Unless forced by death, divorce, or severe financial distress, homeowners looked at the replacement costs and said, we are staying put.
They just canceled their lives.
They canceled their moves. They didn't upsize when they had kids. Older couples didn't downsize into condos, which traditionally frees up starter homes for younger buyers.
This cycle broke.
The inventory completely vanished. So even though high rates crushed buyer demand, the sheer lack of sellers kept the supply artificially scarce. That scarcity is what prevented prices from crashing. The market didn't correct. It jammed.
But surely there's a magic interest rate that unfreezes this machinery, right? We know 6.5 or 7% keeps people paralyzed. What if the Fed cuts rates significantly and mortgage rates drop down to, say, 5%? Doesn't that pick the lock on the golden handcuffs?
It's a common hope. But let's run the math on that $551,000 loan again.
Okay.
If rates drop to 5%, your monthly payment is still about $2,961.
Still so high.
That is still enormously higher than the $1,600 you were paying on your old 3% loan. The reality is rates would have to plummet down into the mid-4s to even begin thawing this market in a meaningful way.
And even then,
Ah,
Even if rates hit 4.5%, the base price of the house still went from 500,000 up to 689,000.
exactly.
The baseline sticker price is permanently higher, so the trap still exists.
That is the cruel irony of the rate shock. The asset prices were inflated by the cheap money, but the expensive money didn't deflate the prices, it just locked them in amber. It is a perfect paralyzing storm.
Oh, okay, so the market is in a deep freeze. Existing owners can't afford to sell, and new buyers can't afford to buy. The music stopped, and everyone is stuck in the chair they were sitting in.
That's where we are.
But human biology doesn't care about the Federal Reserve. Families are still growing. Young adults are still graduating and moving out. People still need a physical place to live. If nobody can buy and nobody can sell, what happens to the rental market when it has to absorb all these stranded, frustrated buyers?
This is where the crisis stops being just an academic frustration for aspiring homeowners and turns into a grinding daily reality for millions of Americans.
Mm.
Because for a long time, there was this widely held belief, a false hope really, that renting was going to be a safe harbor.
Right. The conventional wisdom passed around by every financial advisor on TikTok was, don't buy into this crazy inflated market. The rates are too high. The prices are absurd. Just rent a place for a year or two. Wait it out. The market will normalize and you'll be in a better position. Renting was supposed to be a neutral waiting room.
But renting did not behave like a neutral waiting room. It behaved like a ratchet.
A ratchet.
Yes. Because remember, those would-be buyers who gave up didn't disappear into thin air. They flooded the rental market,
Yeah.
driving up demand for apartments and single-family rental homes. And inflation hit the rental market incredibly hard.
Hard.
Since early 2020, the rent of a primary residence is up roughly 31%.
Wait, 31% higher rent across the board?
Yes. And we look at a broader metric called owner's equivalent rent, which tracks shelter costs overall, and that is up 32% over the same period.
Before we go further, clarify owner's equivalent rent for me. I see that term in inflation reports all the time, but what actually is it? I always get confused by that one.
It's a metric used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to calculate inflation. Instead of tracking home prices, which are viewed as an investment asset, they track the service of shelter.
Okay, the service.
They essentially ask homeowners, if someone were to rent your home today, how much would it rent for? It's a way to measure the ongoing cost of housing services, and it makes up a massive portion of the Consumer Price Index.
Gotcha.
And when owner's equivalent rent is up 32%, it means the fundamental cost of keeping a roof over your head, regardless of whether you own or rent, has surged.
And here's where it gets really interesting and honestly incredibly frustrating for the average person. We hear in the news all the time, great news, inflation is cooling, inflation is down to 3%. But when the average person looks at their lease renewal, it doesn't feel like it's cooling at all. It feels like they're still drowning.
That's because of the difference between disinflation and deflation.
Let's define those.
Disinflation simply means prices are rising slower than they were before. It does not mean prices are dropping back to where they were in 2019.
They're still going up, just not as fast.
Exactly. By March 2026, shelter inflation was rising by about 2.6 to 3.1%. That sounds historically normal, but it is stacking on top of that massive 31% baseline increase that already happened. The renter is now permanently living on a vastly higher cost base.
Let's visualize the position of that renter for everyone listening who might be in this exact spot. They originally wanted to buy, but they couldn't. Before the pandemic, the data showed that middle-income households could afford roughly 50% of the homes listed for sale on the market.
It was a coin flip.
Right, it was basically a coin flip. Half the market was open to you. Today, middle-income households can afford only about 21% of homes listed.
The menu of options shrank by more than half. They are functionally locked out of the purchase market.
So they are trapped renting. And it's like being stuck in a doctor's waiting room, but the receptionist is charging you by the minute just to sit in the chair.
That's exactly what it is.
You are desperately trying to save for a down payment so you can eventually escape the waiting room. But your landlord just hiked your rent by $300 a month. That $300 was supposed to go into your down payment savings account.
What you're describing is the exact mechanism of how renting transforms from a simple 10-year choice. Do I prefer the flexibility of leasing or the permanence of owning? Into a fundamental balance sheet crisis.
A balance sheet crisis.
Yes. When you pay a mortgage, even a painful, expensive one, a small fraction of that payment goes toward your loan principal. You are building a tiny sliver of equity. You are paying yourself.
It's forced savings.
Exactly. When you rent under these strained high inflation conditions, you are paying for shelter, yes, but you're also paying an invisible tax. You are paying the price of being shut out of ownership.
The price of being shut out of ownership, that is a heavy concept. Because every time you sign a lease renewal at a higher rate, your timeline to buy a house doesn't just pause, it actively gets pushed back another year. Waiting has a literal monthly cost that drains your reserves.
And this is where we have to look beyond the real estate pages and look at the broader society. When millions of households are trapped in this loop, spending more on basic shelter, saving less, watching the goalposts of homeownership continually recede, it changes the trajectory of their entire lives.
Let's extrapolate on that, because this isn't just about whether you get granite countertops or a two-car garage. This is about foundational human milestones.
It's about how we structure a life.
Right. Say you are 30 years old. You went to college, you got a decent job, and your life plan was to buy a small house, get married, and have a baby. But now your rent eats your down payment, and you can't afford a house. Do you decide to have a baby in a cramped one-bedroom apartment where the landlord might hike the rent 15% next year?
Most people won't.
A lot of people are looking at the math and saying, no, we can't.
They are delaying household formation entirely. They are delaying marriage. They are having fewer children or deciding to start their families much later in life.
It changes everything.
They are passing up career-advancing job opportunities in other cities because they can't afford to give up their current, somewhat manageable lease. Or, conversely, they can't afford to move to a city where the better jobs are because the local housing costs are insurmountable.
It's a total domino effect. If you don't buy a house until you're 45 instead of 30, that means you're going to be paying a mortgage well into your 70s. It changes your retirement math completely. We've taken a real estate issue and allowed it to mutate into a structural, generational, societal crisis.
And human nature dictates that when millions of people are trapped in a stressful, seemingly inescapable loop like this, they are going to look for someone to blame.
Naturally. We want a bad guy.
The financial pressure builds, the pain is acute, and people desperately want a villain. It's a lot easier to point a finger at a bad guy in a suit than it is to understand the macroeconomic impacts of federal monetary policy over a 15-year period.
Oh, I see this all the time in my own neighborhood Facebook groups. Everyone wants a scapegoat. And the number one scapegoat in the public consciousness right now is Wall Street. Institutional investors.
Private equity.
Right. The popular narrative is that massive private equity firms swept into our towns with billions of dollars and bought up every single starter home in America, turning us all into corporate serfs. But how much of that narrative is actually true?
It's an incredibly powerful narrative, and it feels emotionally true when you're a regular person trying to use a traditional mortgage, and you keep getting outbid by a faceless LLC offering all cash.
It hurts. It feels rigged.
It does. But if we are going to accurately diagnose this crisis, we have to parse the hard data from the fiction. And the first thing we need to do is define what the data means when it says investor.
Why? What does it mean?
Because those reports often lump very different entities together into one terrifying statistic.
Right. Investor is a huge umbrella term. I mean, my uncle who rents out his old condo is technically an investor.
Exactly. A retired couple who owns a duplex across town and rents out half of it to supplement their fixed income. They are classified in the data as an investor.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yes. A local contractor who buys 2 distressed, run-down houses a year, fixes the plumbing, and flips them. Investor. A regional property manager with a portfolio of 20 single-family homes. Investor.
Okay, so it's a huge mix of people.
And yes, a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund operating a massive real estate investment trust. Also an investor. They are not all the same. They don't have the same access to capital, and they don't impact the market in the same way.
Wait, before you go on, define a real estate investment trust, or REIT for me. How is that different from a regular company buying a house?
A REIT is a company that owns, operates, or finances income-producing real estate. Think of it somewhat like a mutual fund, but instead of buying stocks in tech companies, it pools money from thousands of investors to buy real estate assets.
Like commercial buildings.
Like apartment buildings, cell towers, or in this case, thousands of single-family rental homes. They allow average people to invest in large-scale real estate without having to actually buy or manage property themselves. By law, they have to distribute the majority of their taxable income to shareholders as dividends.
Okay, so these are massive, highly organized capital pools. So let's look at the national reality. The narrative says they own everything. What do the numbers actually say?
Overall, investors of all types, from your uncle to Wall Street, make up about 30% of single-family purchases.
Okay, that sounds huge.
It does sound huge. But when we isolate the data to just the large institutional investors, the real Wall Street entities everyone is angry at, the picture changes dramatically.
What's the real number?
The Urban Institute ran the numbers, and they found that large institutional investors own roughly 574,000 single-family homes nationwide.
574,000 homes, which, sounds like a terrifyingly big number until you put it into the context of the entire housing stock.
Right. Out of the entire one-unit rental market in the United States, those 574,000 homes represent about 3.8%.
Just 3.8%.
Yes, 3.8% is a real number. It is not zero, and it represents a massive amount of wealth.
Sure.
But mathematically speaking, 3.8% is absolutely not large enough to single-handedly explain a nationwide housing crisis that has paralyzed transaction volumes from Maine to California.
Okay, but I want to push back here. Because real estate isn't a national average. Real estate is intensely hyper-local. If I am trying to buy a house in a specific city, I don't care that Wall Street only owns 3.8% nationally. I care about what they are doing in my specific zip code.
And that is the crucial caveat. You are entirely correct. Nationally, they are a small piece of the pie. But institutional capital is not spread evenly across the country like peanut butter.
It's clumped together.
It is highly, highly concentrated. These firms are run by algorithms and analysts. They look for specific metrics: strong population growth, rising rents, migration inflows, and housing stock that is relatively new and easy to manage at scale.
They aren't buying 100-year-old homes with bad foundations in rural Vermont.
No, they avoid those completely. They're targeting the Sun Belt.
Right. Places where the weather is warm and the population is booming, like Jacksonville, Florida.
Exactly. In certain high-growth metros, the Government Accountability Office found that institutional ownership of single-family rentals can range from 4% all the way up to 22%.
22%.
In Jacksonville specifically, in 2024, it hit that 22% mark.
Almost a quarter of the market.
Yes. And looking at that local concentration forces us to ask a more nuanced analytical question. Are these institutions the disease, or are they a symptom?
Oh, that's an interesting distinction. Explain that.
Institutions do not invent housing markets out of thin air. They don't create the foundational crisis. They identify and exploit existing constraints.
They find the weak spots.
They look at a city like Jacksonville and see the underlying math. Hundreds of thousands of people are moving there. The local government isn't permitting enough new construction to keep pace with the influx, and rental demand is skyrocketing because regular people are locked out of buying due to high interest rates.
So they just swoop in.
The institutions see that structural imbalance, and they swoop in to monetize it. They act as amplifiers, pouring high-octane capital onto a fire that was already burning. They are not the root cause, but in specific local markets, they absolutely make a bad situation substantially worse for the entry-level buyer.
Because think about the mechanics of a transaction. If you're a young family in Jacksonville trying to buy a $350,000 starter house, you are using an FHA loan, which, for those who don't know, is a government-backed loan designed to help people buy with lower down payments, sometimes as low as 3.5%.
It's a very common tool for first-time buyers.
Right, it's a lifeline. But if you walk into a bidding war armed with an FHA loan, and you are competing against a multi-billion-dollar real estate investment trust offering all cash, waiving all inspections, and promising to close in 10 days, you are going to lose. Every single time. The seller is always going to take the fast, sure cash.
You lose. And more importantly, that specific house is permanently removed from the path of homeownership. It is transferred into the permanent corporate rental stock. That is incredibly painful on a local level, even if it doesn't statistically explain the national crisis.
So when people are hurting, they look for scapegoats like Wall Street, but they also look for silver bullets. They look for gimmicks to magically fix the math. And one of the most prominent ideas floating around the internet and even among some policymakers to solve affordability is the 50-year mortgage.
Yes, the 50-year mortgage. It pops up every single time affordability reaches a breaking point.
Sounds so tempting.
On paper, to a layman, it sounds like a lifeline.
Let's do the math on it because I want to play devil's advocate here and see if this actually works.
Let's do it.
Let's go back to our $689,000 house where the buyer needs a $551,500 loan. We established that at a 6.3% rate on a standard 30-year mortgage, the monthly payment is a brutal $3,414.
Right.
Now, if we stretch that exact same loan amount out to 50 years, the payment drops to $2,976. That is a savings of $438 every single month. To a family struggling to buy groceries and pay for daycare, saving over $400 a month sounds like a massive, life-changing relief. Isn't that a good thing? Why shouldn't we offer that lifeline?
It is a lifeline in the exact same way that putting a bucket under a leaking roof is a lifeline.
Oh, interesting.
It manages the immediate, visible mess on the floor, but it does absolutely nothing to fix the hole in the roof. If we unpack the financial mechanics of a 50-year loan, you'll see it is a payment management tool. It is absolutely not an affordability fix.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics. Why is it dangerous?
When you take out a mortgage, the loan amortizes, meaning a portion of your payment goes to the interest charged by the bank, and a portion goes toward paying down the principal balance of the house.
Right.
On a standard 30-year loan, the early years are heavy on interest, but you slowly start building equity. When you stretch a loan to 50 years, you dramatically alter that amortization schedule.
How bad is it?
For the first 15 to 20 years, almost your entirely monthly payment is going straight to interest. You are paying thousands of dollars a month, but you are not paying down the debt. You own virtually none of your home.
You're basically just renting the house from the bank at that point, but you're responsible for fixing the boiler when it breaks?
Precisely. You take on all the liability of ownership with almost none of the wealth-building benefits. And the lifetime interest you pay over 50 years is astronomical.
That's depressing.
But there is a deeper, more dangerous macroeconomic problem here. If the market learns that we can just stretch the debt to 40 or 50 years to make the monthly payment look palatable, then the underlying prices of the homes never have to come down.
Ah, I see it. Because the seller looks at the market and says, well, the buyer can technically afford the monthly payment on a 50-year term, so I'm not dropping my asking price.
Exactly. It preserves and subsidizes the inflated price structure. Instead of the market correcting, instead of homes becoming truly cheaper relative to local incomes, the market just learns to extend the duration of the debt.
Just like what happened with car loans going to 84 months.
Exactly like that.
It's
The financial illusion that ensures the buyer remains in debt for their entire working life, just to prop up the artificially high asset prices created during the era of cheap money.
Wow. Okay. So Wall Street is an amplifier, not the root cause.
Yeah.
And a 50-year mortgage is a Band-Aid that actually infects the wound. We've established the national structure of the crisis.
Yes.
We've debunked the universal scapegoats and the gimmicky silver bullets. But to truly deeply understand how this crisis operates, we have to look at a map.
We have to go local.
Because while the interest rates are national, the crisis mutates, almost like a virus, depending on the zip code you are standing in.
That is a vital transition. The housing crisis is national in its structure, meaning the interest rate shock hit absolutely everyone from Maine to California at the exact same time. The Fed doesn't set different rates for different states.
Right. Everyone gets the 7% rate.
But the crisis is completely regional in its mechanism. The way the crisis actually functions, the reason it hurts, depends entirely on the local dynamics of the state or the city.
We've got 5 distinct regional profiles to go through, and they are fascinating because they show how totally different symptoms can lead to the exact same disease of unaffordability. Let's start with Texas.
Texas is a perfect place to start because it challenges a lot of our assumptions about supply and demand.
How so?
If you look at reports from organizations like Realtor.com grading states on their home building efforts, their zoning laws, and their affordability initiatives, Texas scores an A-.
An A-, that's great.
That is incredibly high. They are building a massive amount of housing, they have plenty of land, and they are not paralyzed by the severe restrictive zoning regulations you see on the coasts.
Right. They're building sprawling subdivisions as fast as they can pour concrete. So theoretically, high supply should mean lower prices. Problem solved, right?
Not quite, because over a recent 5-year period, home prices in Texas still jumped 35.54%.
Wait, why? If they're building so much...
Because you have to look at the other side of the ledger.
Oh.
In a single year, Texas added 391,243 people to its population.
Almost 400,000 people in 1 year. That's like picking up the entire population of New Orleans and dropping it into Texas every 12 months.
Exactly. Texas proves a very sobering point about the current crisis. Even strong, robust, highly rated supply-side building efforts can be completely overwhelmed by massive, relentless migration.
The demand is just too intense.
They are building incredibly fast, but they simply cannot outbuild that level of human influx, especially when the national financial regime of cheap money had already elevated the base prices everywhere.
Okay, so Texas is overwhelmed by sheer volume. Let's look at profile number 2, North Carolina.
North Carolina is a slightly different mechanism. They also grade very well on home building efforts, a solid B+. But over that same 5-year period, their home prices exploded by 54.50%.
54%. If you live in Raleigh or Charlotte, a 54% increase in housing costs over 5 years is absolutely life-altering. Why did it spike so high there?
The story here is driven by the rise of remote work and the search for affordability. North Carolina spent years building a reputation as a wonderful, lower-cost haven with a great quality of life.
It's beautiful there.
It is. People living in high-cost areas like New York, New Jersey, or California looked at the listing prices in Raleigh and thought, this is paradise. It's so cheap. But a place is only a bargain until enough people notice it.
Right. You have remote workers coming in, keeping their New York salaries, and bidding on North Carolina houses.
Exactly. When someone with a San Francisco tech salary moves to North Carolina, they view a $500,000 house as an absolute steal. They will happily bid $550,000 in cash.
Wow. Yeah.
But the local wage earners, the teachers, nurses, and retail workers who make North Carolina salaries, suddenly find themselves completely priced out of their own hometowns by an influx of out-of-state capital. The lower-cost haven was ruined by its own popularity. The bargain eroded.
Which flows perfectly into Profile 3, South Carolina and specifically the Charleston area.
South Carolina actually posted the fastest population growth rate in the entire country over a 1-year period, growing by 1.5% and adding over 66,000 people.
Okay.
And their price gains reflect that intense, concentrated pressure. They saw the highest price gain in our data set at an astonishing 58.03% over 5 years.
58%. And yet, looking at the data, they get an A grade in home building. How is that possible? I mean, how can South Carolina get an A in home building but still see prices jump 58%? It's like getting an A in swimming while the pool is rapidly draining.
It's a great analogy. The grade simply means the local governments are trying, they're issuing permits, they're attempting to address the supply side.
But it's not working.
Grading supply efforts doesn't erase the underlying physical and economic math of desirability. Charleston has a deadly combination of 3 factors. First, massive migration, similar to North Carolina.
Check.
Second, severe geographical constraints. Charleston is a coastal city surrounded by water, rivers, and protected wetlands. You can't just build outward endlessly in all directions like you can in Dallas. The land is physically limited.
And the third factor?
Tourism. Charleston is incredibly desirable as a vacation destination. Because of this, it has a highly active short-term rental market.
Ah, the Airbnbs.
Right. When residential homes can be legally converted into highly lucrative hospitality assets, essentially mini hotels for tourists paying premium nightly rates, it introduces an entirely new layer of intense financial demand that has absolutely nothing to do with local residents trying to find a place to sleep.
So if you were trying to buy a house in Charleston, you aren't just competing against the local teacher. You are competing against an out-of-state remote worker, and you are competing against an investor trying to run an Airbnb empire, all fighting over a physically limited number of houses on a small peninsula. No wonder prices are up 58%.
Precisely. Now let's pivot to Profile 4, which is a very different and very alarming flavor of pain. Florida, specifically the Tampa Bay area.
Right, Florida. Over the 5-year window, prices there are up 50.31%. But here is a massive curveball in the data. Currently, year over year, home prices in Florida are actually dropping by 2.73%.
Yes, they are.
So prices are falling. Does that mean the crisis is finally over in Florida? Can buyers rejoice?
Not at all. In fact, it might be more financially stressful to buy a house in Florida right now than ever before.
Wait, why if the price is down?
First, a 2.7% drop barely makes a microscopic dent in a 50% run-up. But more importantly, The monthly financial burden of owning a home in Florida is remaining brutally high or even increasing because of something completely outside of the mortgage rate: insurance.
Oh, right. The property insurance crisis down there is legendary at this point.
It is a systemic catastrophe. You might be able to negotiate the actual purchase price of the house down slightly because the market has cooled. But when you go to insure the property, which your mortgage lender legally requires you to do, you find that property insurance premiums have tripled or quadrupled in just a few years.
Because of the hurricanes.
Due to hurricane risk, yes, but also massive amounts of roofing litigation and soaring reinsurance costs. The home is not actually more affordable on a monthly basis. The cost has just stealthily shifted from the principal payment over to the insurance underwriter.
Oh, that's terrible.
Add in the same tourism and short-term rental pressures we saw in Charleston, and the market in Florida is cooling in terms of transaction volume, but it's providing absolutely zero financial relief to the average household budget.
It's a phantom cool down. You think you're getting a deal on the house until the insurance underwriter hands you a bill for $6,000 a year just to cover the roof? Okay, let's look at the final regional profile. Profile 5, the Midwest, specifically places like Minnesota and North Dakota.
These are markets that generally do not make the front page of the Wall Street Journal's real estate section.
Right.
They have much slower population growth compared to the booming Sunbelt states like Texas or Florida. They don't have massive influxes of tech workers or huge short-term rental tourism industries, but their prices are still up significantly.
What are the numbers?
Over 5 years, Minnesota is up 32.37%, and North Dakota is up 34.54%.
And some people might look at that and say, well, 32% over 5 years isn't terrible compared to South Carolina's 58%.
From a high-level national charting perspective, sure, the curve isn't as steep, but housing is lived locally. If you live and work in Fargo, North Dakota, a 34% increase in the cost of a home is utterly devastating if the local wages in Fargo haven't moved at the exact same pace.
Which they usually haven't.
Right. The affordability in these regions is ruined because local incomes were suddenly asked to absorb a national asset repricing driven by the Fed's monetary policy. The national rate structure acts like a giant magnifying glass, focusing intense heat on whatever local vulnerability a state already has.
I love that analogy.
In Florida, the vulnerability is insurance and extreme weather. In Charleston, it's geography and tourism. In the Midwest, it's local wages failing to keep up with national asset inflation.
That is such a brilliant way to frame it. The national interest rate structure is the sun, and the local geography is the magnifying glass. It burns everyone, but it starts the fire in very different ways depending on where you hold it.
And that brings us to the core reality of why this topic is so difficult to solve. The crisis is universal because the monetary structure is national. But the lived experience, the specific pain you feel when you write that check every month, is entirely dependent on the specific mechanisms of your local market.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. So what does this all mean? Let's synthesize everything we've uncovered in this deep dive.
If we look at the entire chain reaction we've discussed today, it paints a very clear, if sobering, picture of sequential failure.
Right. Let's trace the sequence one last time. Step 1, cheap money, kept artificially low by the Fed for over a decade to stimulate the economy, dramatically inflated the base price of the housing asset. People used cheap debt to bid up prices.
Correct.
Step 2, a violent, rapid interest rate shock arrived to fight inflation, and instead of lowering housing prices, it locked the market in a deep freeze because existing owners simply could not afford the replacement cost to surrender their cheap debt.
Exactly. Step 3. Millions of frustrated would-be buyers were forced into the rental market. This drove up rental demand and created a ratchet effect where shelter inflation continually ate their down payment savings, making the bridge to ownership even longer and more expensive.
It's just punishing.
Step 4. Investors and institutions acting as amplifiers swooped into specific high-growth Sunbelt markets, intensifying the local pain for entry-level buyers. And finally, geography dictated exactly how that pain was delivered, whether through overwhelming migration, crushing insurance premiums, or stagnant local wages.
It is a flawless, terrible sequence. And I think the core lesson here, the thing we really want to communicate today, is that the country didn't just experience standard inflation. We fundamentally changed the meaning of housing in America.
We really did.
It transitioned from being a reliable, legible ladder for the middle class, a
Hmm.
path to build equity and security through honest work and saving into an exclusionary gate. And passing through that gate now depends far less on your work ethic and far more on your timing, your prior equity, your generational wealth, and quite frankly, blind luck.
It shifted from a reward for labor into a reward for timing.
Mm.
If you bought in 2019, you are a genius. If you try to buy in 2026, you are penalized.
Mm.
And that arbitrary separation fundamentally changes the psychological fabric of the country.
It really does. So I want to connect back to you listening to this right now. If you are staring down a terrifying lease renewal, or if you are feeling trapped in a house you've outgrown just because you have a 3% mortgage and can't afford to move, or if you've put in 10 offers on a starter home and been outbid by an LLC every single time, I want you to hear this clearly.
Yeah.
You are not crazy.
You're not.
You are not failing at adulthood. The invisible financial machinery around you fundamentally broke. The rules of the game were retroactively changed while you were playing it.
That is the most important takeaway. The frustration you feel is a completely rational response to a structurally irrational environment.
Now, before we sign off, we always like to leave you with a final provocative thought. Something we didn't fully explore today, but something that builds directly on everything we've uncovered. Something for you to mull over.
We spent this entire deep dive talking about young families trying to buy, or renters trying to save for a down payment. But consider the long-term macroeconomic horizon. Think about the American retirement system.
Right. Social Security, pensions, 401ks.
The entire mathematical foundation of American retirement, the very reason Social Security payouts are structured the way they are, was built on a very specific structural assumption.
What assumption?
The assumption was that by the time an average worker reached 65 or 70 years old, their 30-year mortgage would be entirely paid off. Their housing costs would drop to near zero, leaving them responsible only for property taxes and maintenance. That assumption is how retirees are supposed to survive on fixed incomes.
Oh, wow. I see where this is going. If you don't own the house outright, the math of retirement doesn't work.
Exactly. If we now have an entire generation of Americans who are systematically delayed in achieving home ownership by a decade or more, or who are permanently shut out and forced to rent for their entire lives, what happens in 20 or 30 years?
It's terrifying to think about.
If you enter retirement at age 65 and you do not own a home, and you are still paying a spiraling market rate rent that increases by 3 to 5% every single year, the math of aging in America completely collapses. Social Security payouts cannot cover a modern, inflation-adjusted market rent.
That is chilling. If the ladder of housing is frozen, the safety net of retirement shreds along with it. We aren't just pricing people out of a backyard or a second bathroom. We are pricing an entire generation out of a dignified old age.
It is the ultimate catastrophic downstream consequence of everything we've discussed today. The housing crisis is a retirement crisis. It just hasn't fully arisen yet.
Well, on that heavy but incredibly important note, we are going to wrap up this deep dive. I keep going back to that image of the frozen ladder. The rungs are icy, the wind is howling, it is incredibly difficult to climb, but understanding the weather is the very first step to surviving it. Keep questioning the systems around you. Keep looking beyond the sticker price. Keep exploring. We'll be right here waiting to unpack the next big issue with you. Until then, take care.